Let me do this in like 3 minutes or less, give you an idea of what you're doing with the essay and what we've been doing in the class. We've looked at the history of climate denial. We've connected it with the Tobacco Institute. And as we get into the Heritage Foundation, as we look at Luntz's frames, what we're looking at is a deeply funded ExxonMobil, the American Petroleum Institute, the Koch brothers, the Mercers, a deeply funded disinformation campaign that has politicians pushing the emotions of the voters, and that has contrarian scientists and fossil fuel funded think tanks like the Heritage producing documentation that gives a polish and a legitimacy to the groundless claims of contrarian scientists, that is, climate denialists. That's the intellectual world. And when you get into your essay, let me go one step forward, one step backwards. For the Heritage, keep in mind, Rush Limbaugh is a prime example of the reach of the Heritage Foundation. The late Limbaugh was a conservative radio host, one of the most popular in history, with an audience of about 20 million a day for his 3-hour program. And he was all in for heritage and all in for climate denial. So here's a conservative radio host, and there are a few thousand of them, reading from the Heritage, keeping their climate denial alive. And because he's one of the believers, one of the faithful, and he trusts the Heritage, it gives these people a sense of speaking the truth. So the Heritage Foundation article is a very polished way of informing people who are already members of the choir, giving them a refreshed songbook from time to time to remind them how climate change is a big hoax. So it's really a cool thing. And that's and then when we get into the essay, I just want to give you in mind there are two different focal points. And for the Luntz memo, it's about how his talking points work on the voters. You'll want, before you write your paragraphs, you want to define the Luntz frame in your own words. You're going to want to make sure you have quotes from the Luntz that exactly nail how that frame is going to be used in connection with the quotes you bring in from the talking heads. If you have all that evidence, the Luntz lines, the talking heads lines, before you write your paragraph, it will have a focus. And your analysis is going to bend towards how that message influences the voters. When you get into heritage, here's a good example. You've got Rush Limbaugh, and then you have Mr. Trump using a heritage talking point as well. What you're looking at there is how they provide, and I'm going to put quote unquote intellectual backbone for climate denialists like Trump, like Rush Limbaugh. They can speak with confidence because they're in that conservative message echo chamber where everything the Heritage says is gospel. And so what you're going to look at is the sophistication of their deception. I would recommend just taking any one section and discuss how the writers at the Heritage are like corporate attorneys protecting their client, choose arguments, whatever argument it is for that section, that are critical for the fossil fuel industry. And it's all targeted. The 97%, which is true, if the majority of scientists, the vast majority, almost the entirety of science, agrees that CO2 is heating up the planet and the fossil fuels are to blame, their industry is dead. They have to kill that statistic. When they talk about the medieval warming period, it's important to them to cast climate change as part of a larger historic pattern. You guys got that in your discussions. And that takes fossil fuels off the hook. We're just another wave in a long series of hundreds of thousand-year waves. So what's happening today has nothing to do with fossil fuels. Again, how that message works for the fossil fuel industry. It's not factually correct. It's absolute nonsense. But once you do that, you articulate why the argument is important to the fossil fuel industry for one section. Then you have a couple of choices here. You can unpack the language, which is very tricky. You can certainly, but the loaded language is part of the the messaging. You can also look into the footnotes, and most of them, not all of them, most of them will point to climate denialists and what they refer to real quickly here as the contrarian scientist. That is, for every one of them, there are several hundred who say, no, he's crazy. All right, so they're going to either include contrarian scientists, or they will use documents by legitimate scientists in such a way that they're taken out of context, because there is no evidence for their lie. So it's a very tricky thing. You want to look into those footnotes. You want to show how they woozle. They have shabby citation. And then the other thing you can look at in the heritage is get an idea of how that message, how the style, how the layout, the footnotes, the elevated language, how that really works for the conservative commentators who are, telling tens of millions of people each day that climate change is a hoax. I hope that gives you a focus, just to know where you're going and why you're going. And then also, just as a parting note for the class, the whole goal here is to understand the arguments and the strategies so that as you move beyond this class, you'll have good ears for how the climate disinformation campaign rolls out. I hope this helps you. Focus on the last essay.